Hi everyone, and welcome to my third and final lecture on linking science to policy. And so, as we've discussed in the last two lectures, we talked about the context in which Earth system governance occurs, and also the lenses of inquiry through which we might examine these contexts of Earth system governance. And so this is figure 1 from the reading, and what you can see in figure 1 is that there are these intersections. And really that's what this article is about. It's about thinking of these intersections in terms of a framework for moving forward in the Anthropocene in Earth system governance. And so when we think of, for example, the intersection between the context of a transformation in governance and the idea of democracy and power being something that is important in governing that transformation, a research question here might be, under what conditions can transformations be democratic? Likewise, if we move here to thinking about the context of the Anthropocene and the lens of justice and allocation, we might think of a question like, how do Anthropocene framings reconceptualize justice and allocation? Likewise, if we look at the context of inequality and the lens of anticipation and imagination, we might ask, who has access to and is empowered by processes of anticipation and imagination? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go through each of these different lenses and try to identify some different types of inquiry that we might think about as we move forward in Earth system governance. And so if we first move to this context of architecture and agency, and we start to think about the context of transformation, the Earth System Governance Project really is trying to figure out the pathways to shape or block these structures and regimes and institutions, right? So structures, regimes, institutions, and also actors, right? And so the architecture and agency of governance structures are going to be really important when we think about how transformations occur, right? And so what are the pathways that shape or block these transformations from occurring? Now, if we talk about inequality, we can talk about questions that deal with analyzing how questions that analyze how architecture and agency entrench or disrupt these interactions between actors, okay? And so we can really think about how inequity is really pervasive throughout all of our world and all of humanity, and start to think about how architecture and agency can be restructured to account and combat these issues of inequality. Now, if we talk about the context of the Anthropocene, and I'm sorry, it is a squeaky pen. We can ask ourselves what kinds of scales are needed in the Anthropocene for thinking about Earth system governance in terms of architecture and agency, right? We talked about this in the last lecture, that scales can range from local to regional to global. And so in the Anthropocene, we have this, we're living in this uncertain time of human agency. And so that will certainly be a challenge in terms of thinking about how we structure our governments, and who is doing the governing. Lastly, for architecture and agency, we can think about the context of diversity. And in that context, we can ask ourselves how complex interactions in terms of architecture and agency, who is making those decisions, can result in better or more sustainable environmental outcomes, and also in terms of environmental governance outcomes. Now moving on to democracy and power, we can look at these same contexts and think about how we might develop a research agenda that includes these contexts and accounts for these contexts in governance. Okay, and so if we think about democracy and power in the context of transformation, we can ask ourselves, how do transformations produce opportunities for democracy and power to either reproduce democracy and power structures that work, or to replace existing structures. If we think about inequality, we can ask research questions in terms of Earth system governance to think about how we can overcome inequality through restructuring democracy and power. Again, bringing more diverse voices in, and also thinking about who produces the knowledge and who the actors are who are involved in governance. In terms of the Anthropocene, we can identify, is the Anthropocene, again, we're living in a very rapidly changing present and future, as we all know, as we're dealing with this tremendous crisis before us. And so the question is whether or not we can identify new governance structures. Because of course there's no guarantee that these current governance structures of democracy and power are going to work in the Anthropocene. And certainly many of them have promoted inequality and a lack of diversity in the governance process, especially when we think about colonialism, for example, and even today, of course. So again, in terms of diversity, we've already talked about some of these things, but the idea is to provide a space for voices, diverse in the democratic process and in terms of empowering people to be involved in the governance process, and the importance of multiple knowledge systems. Right? One world, many voices. Remember that? The one world world, where this is really accounted for when we think about democracy and the distribution of power. Next, I want to move on to justice and allocation. And when we think about that, in terms of these different contexts, we can think about how, for example, when we think of transformations, we can ask questions about how do we enact transformations that are just and that also distribute justice equally. Okay. Now, if we think about inequality, we can also ask ourselves, under what conditions that exacerbate, what conditions exacerbate or mitigate inequity. In terms of the Anthropocene, we can also think about how justice and allocation are changing rapidly in the Anthropocene. And that there may also be novel pathways in the Anthropocene, right? So breaking down that idea of path dependence is really important when we think about justice and allocation in the context of Earth system governance. And then lastly, if we think about diversity, we can ask how, again, diverse worldviews can be incorporated into this. And just like with democracy and power, with justice and allocation, we can think of these as the importance really of polycentrism and polycentric governance, right? Which is a topic that was brought up several times in the article. Lastly, I want to talk about anticipation and imagination, which are certainly going to be required as we move forward in this very uncertain time of environmental crisis for our planet. Okay, so now let's think about this context of transformation, right? So again, we think back to this idea of robust decision-making and trying to predict diverse futures, but predict and try to find pathways towards sustainable futures under uncertainty. And so when we think about these transformations that need to occur in the way that we govern environmental resources and the changes that need to occur in terms of the structures, regimes, and actors, we need to think about what are diverse futures. We've talked about this before in the context of robust decision making. And so that's going to be really important as we move forward. We need to be able to anticipate a variety of different future potential outcomes, and we need to use creativity and imagination in order to move forward in this very uncertain world. Inequality. So we need to take it seriously. And we need to consider access and participation. And this isn't going to be easy to do. It is not easy to account for many voices in order to try to break through barriers of inequality that are entrenched in hundreds of years of our Earth's history. The Anthropocene also can be a context for anticipating and imagining diverse futures. Lastly, if we think about diversity, we need to, again, same as all of these other ones, we need to promote diverse perspectives. So admittedly, this one is pretty much the same for all of them. It's a one world and empowering people and bringing people to the forefront and involving them in Earth system governance. So hopefully these 3 small lectures have given you a chance to really think about current research that's being done by a variety of different scientists and policymakers across the globe to try to confront a lot of these issues that we're experiencing today to try to create a sustainable future. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed my first recorded lectures.